So, in this chapter, this is perhaps one of the most difficult chapters, probably, in this class. And it really represents the beginning of Keynesian economic theory, macroeconomic theory. Um, if we want to understand um, what this chapter is trying to do, is it's trying to set up the idea that there is an aggregate output of the economy that's made up of, if you remember from the GDP chapter, of C plus I plus G. Um, and we're looking here at a closed market, so we're not going to look at NX. So Y, which is the GDP, is equal to C plus I plus G. And so, as you can see here in this kind of overview of all these other chapters, which we're not going to look at until a little bit later here, um, that we're going to start to look at how the overall economy is built up. So let's look at that. This is the formal name of this chapter would be Aggregate Expenditures and Equilibrium Output. And as I said, this is the basic modeling for Keynesian economics. So let's put in perspective and remind ourselves what Keynes was trying to do. Keynes was trying to understand how an economy could be out of equilibrium for an extended period of time, which is a different way of understanding what the Great Depression is, right? Is that it represents an economy below equilibrium for several years and perhaps stuck in that subpar position for several years. And the way that he actually explains that is that um, it's caused by there being a difference between um, what individuals plan to invest or businesses plan to invest and what they actually invested. And that difference can create a difference in the output levels. And so that's what we'll look at here. So let's start first with understanding some of the basic terms of aggregate output and aggregate income. The two are, as we know from our discussion of real GDP, the same in the sense that what is produced, the aggregate output, should equal the aggregate income, the income received for doing that. Um, the two should be equal. And that's kind of our third bullet point here. Production equals income. And this output and income is in real terms, meaning that it accounts for the fact that we're only looking at changes in Q by basically controlling for changes in the price. So we're not looking at things nominally, we're looking at things in real terms. And what Keynes does is he builds up in 1934 the general theory of employment, interest, and money. Um, the one thing he knows is that people don't buy enough stuff when there is a recession. And the simple explanation of that is they don't have enough income. So, what you can start to do is you can start to build up a consumption function. And what that consumption function would do is it would say that total consumption equals some base amount, let's say a base amount that you need to survive, plus some portion times your level of disposable income, which would be your income minus your taxes. So, as an example, it could be, let's say you need $500 a month to buy your basic food and living expenses. Yeah, I know it's pretty low. And then of every dollar you earn after taxes, you spend 80% of that, or 0.8. So this here is going to be known as your marginal propensity to consume. Okay. And if we were to graph it out, it would look something like this, right? Starting out at that base level here of 500. And then having a slope, which is the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, where for every $1 increase in the income, household consumption is going up by 80 cents. And we see that right here. Okay, so that's one of our first Keynesian innovations, is having this formal consumption function that looks like this. So there's our consumption function. There's our marginal propensity to consume. The consumption function having that general form. The other part of the other location where money would go would be that it would go to savings. So savings would be left, what would be left of your disposable income after you've consumed it. So this, as the slide points out, has a triple equal sign, which means that it's just by definition it's true, right? Which would be that if you're not consuming the income, then you're saving it. And that must always be the case just because of the nature of the definitions. Your marginal propensity to consume, if it's 0.8, then your marginal propensity to save would be whatever remains. In this case, it would be 0.2. 0.8 plus 0.2 equals 1. This is important to note because policymakers then would think about things about how to alter the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save in order to change the performance of the economy. And if we were to start to throw some numbers in here, we could do it like this, right? Where you've got your base level of consumption or your autonomous consumption right here, plus your marginal propensity to consume, which is 0.75, which would mean that your marginal propensity to save is 0.25. As you see here, the slope of this consumption function is your marginal propensity to consume, and the y-intercept is that base level of consumption. And if we're add to this further, don't get freaked out by the nature of this graph, how it looks. But we could take it further, and if we added more numbers to this, we could then take the total income, the aggregate income, subtract the consumption, and that would equal our savings. And you could draw a graph for savings as well. You can see this tiny little graph right here. So far, this should be pretty easy. Let's not, again, worry about economics in practice. But then the question is what else is going to determine consumption, right? On some level, we know again that the base level of consumption is determined by what you need to survive. Then let's say the 0.75 or whatever could be socially determined or just influenced by your family's general conditions, right? If you have lots of children, then your marginal propensity to consume is going to be quite high because you're buying lots of stuff to take care of them. But additionally, your consumption levels are going to be determined by your wealth levels, the interest rate, and your expectations for the future. If you're optimistic about the future, you're going to consume more because you're not going to be as worried about losing your job in the future. If interest rates are low, you may consume more now because you can borrow money and the reward for savings is quite low. The interest rate, the reward for saving is quite low. And wealth, if wealth is high, then your consumption is going to be high, higher than whatever your income level is. Now, the Keynesian insight comes from understanding um, planned investment and contrasting that with actual investment, with the difference between the two being changes in inventories. Remember, we talked about inventories earlier. Inventories represent a firm building more stuff or building less stuff than they need to meet current demand. So a firm makes a plan in the beginning of the time period and they think that their sales are going to be a certain amount. So then they get their production line going, they produce that certain amount, and then if the consumption, the demand was unexpectedly lower, well, then the warehouse is going to fill up with this extra good. So it's going to have you're going to have um, an unplanned investment in an unplanned change in inventories. And so that's why there can be a difference. There can be a difference between what you plan the inventory levels to be and what they actually are, which means that you can then have a difference between your planned investment levels and your actual investment levels. If the interest rate increases, then um, um, people are going to build less. Right, inventory levels are not going to be brought up that much. So your level of planned investment spending is going to fall. On the contrary, when the interest rate falls, then it's really cheap to buy warehouse space. It's really cheap to buy whatever you need to produce a lot of stuff. And so firms are going to then build up their inventory levels when the interest rate falls. So increasing the interest rate slows down the economy if we look at it in terms of a firm not building up its inventory levels that much. And when the interest rate falls, that's when the economy picks up because businesses basically start doing um, investments in inventory. And that's what we see right here, this inverse or negative relationship between the interest rate and the level of planned investment. Now, what else is planned investment affected by? Obviously, the biggest thing it's affected by is the interest rate, but it also kind of depends on how businesses feel. Are they optimistic about the future, pessimistic about the future? COVID certainly highlighted things like that. Um, and you even get one of Keynes's more long remembered phrases of animal spirits, which is basically, again, this feeling that an entrepreneur would have about how the future is going to be. Are they optimistic or pessimistic about how future growth in that economy is going to be? If we put that together, what we're looking for is the equilibrium level. And what we're looking for is where the aggregate expenditures, AE, which is simply the summation of the consumption and the planned investment, where that consumption plus planned investment is equal to the aggregate output, the aggregate expenditures. So this right here is where equilibrium is occurring, where planned expenditures is equal essentially to the real GDP, or the aggregate output. And it may not be the case that they are always equal. So the economy may not always be in an equilibrium. In fact, what we could see is that there could be periods of time where the aggregate output is greater than the aggregate expenditures, and times when the aggregate output is less than it. And if that were the case, this table is actually pretty helpful for understanding what would go on and how the economy would basically slowly get back to equilibrium. That when y is equal to 100, that you can get, when aggregate output is equal to 100, then the planned expenditures are equal to 200, which would cause inventory levels to unexpectedly fall by 100 because 200 is 100 greater than 100. Then at an aggregate output of 200, you've got aggregate expenditures of 275. Now you've got a shortfall of 75. Until you get to a point where the aggregate output is equal to the aggregate expenditures. And that's where you get the economy in equilibrium. Now, how do we understand this graphically? To understand this graphically, what you would see here is here's our equilibrium point, and you can see that the equilibrium points all would have to exist on this 45-degree line. Along that 45-degree line, at all points along this 45-degree line, then whatever is on the x-axis would have to equal whatever is on the y-axis, which in this case, the x-axis is the aggregate output, and the y-axis is equal to planned expenditures. And so then we can set this up mathematically as well, where I gave you the consumption function, the 100 plus 0.75y, and if I told you what the planned investment level was, 25, then you could add those two together, rearrange the terms, and solve for y. And if you do, you'll find the same answer that you found in the table of 500. This would be the only point where you're in equilibrium. And what that would mean as well is that that level of planned investment of 50 would also have to be what your savings amount is equal to as well. So that would mean that there's equilibrium in the goods market. There's also equilibrium in the financial market. And you see that in this next graph here. That at that equilibrium point, the savings equals the investment, the planned investment. So one of the other Keynesian insights in this then is where he talks about how the economy goes back to the equilibrium, or again how it could be stuck not in an equilibrium. Essentially what happens is that as a firm builds up its inventories, eventually it says, okay, we got to slow down, we got to draw down this inventory levels. So then they start to reduce their production levels. And as they do that, then the inventory levels fall. And you get to a point where the output is falling. If, on the other hand, the economy is not producing enough, then the inventory levels are very, very low. And firms, as a consequence, then know that they need to produce more stuff to be able to build up their inventory levels back to where they used to be. For Keynes, we've already seen that there is a multiplier effect that's going on, where a variable will change by multiples when some other variable changes a small amount. That multiplier is going to determine the slope of our aggregate expenditure line. So to the extent that we shift that aggregate expenditure line up by increasing it, it's going to shift to a greater extent what our equilibrium level of output is going to be. Let me draw that out for us. So here's our aggregate expenditures. There's my aggregate output / income. I've then got a 45-degree line. Along that 45-degree line, this would always be true. Aggregate output equaling aggregate expenditures. And then I've got a line right here, C plus I plus G. And we've got this equilibrium point right here. But then if something changes that shifts this curve up, let's say by 100, what we're arguing in this slide is that there is a multiplier. And so all we really know for certain is that it would be some amount greater than 100. And that's kind of what you see going on right here in this kind of very small graph for understanding that. I guess the last thing I want to make sure I talk about um, is this notion of the paradox of thrift. So the problem that tends to happen in an economy when it's just about to do badly is that people start to get scared. And so they save more of their money because they're anticipating they're going to lose their job or something really bad's going to happen. And this global pandemic we're just kind of seeing the other side of is a perfect example of that. And so the government wanted to reverse that. Because if it didn't reduce that, then people were saving more money because they were scared, but that also meant they were consuming less, which was going to hurt the recovery of the economy. So you basically need to find a way when you're facing the paradox of thrift to discourage people from saving money. How? Um, well, there's lots of ways you could. Um, there's lots of ways you could do it, but the problem with the paradox of thrift is that it is a phenomenon that tends to occur because individuals do want to survive. There is a great deal of self interest going on here that these individuals um, want to pursue. Okay.